In 1995, the world got their first glimpse of Pierce Brosnan as the world's most famous secret agent. GoldenEye was released and quickly became a worldwide sensation. Everything about this movie is gold, and it's one of my 6 Bond films that I think are perfect 10s. Everything about this movie is perfection. Okay, maybe there's that one thing.
I enjoy a spirited ride as much as the next girl,
But besides that, GoldenEye is a perfect 10. The entire opening sequence for me is fantastic. The bungee jump, such a Bond stunt, and it leads to a completely new story with another 00 agent. The escape, the plane dive, everything. I am gonna eat all that up. I love it. And yeah, okay, the plane dive may be a little cheesy, but I still can like a little cheese stuffed in my filet mignon, so I absolutely love the sequence. And Red Bull had a stunt later where they proved that you actually could do this, so suck it, haters. The story works for me start to finish. I love the locations. Monte Carlo is one of my favorite locations for Bond to be at. There's a great Fleming reference in the Baccarat game at Monte Carlo. And Xenia Onatopp, Boris, Omara, Trevelyan, they're all the best ensemble of villains of all the movies. The pacing is great. Natalia is a great Bond girl, and her story and character arc are well paced and believable. This movie has the best Desmond Llewellyn Q scene of all the movies, without question. The mentor/young buck dynamic that the two have is a treat to watch. Valentine and Jack Wade are so much fun, they add a lot of lighthearted comic relief. Xenia adds the raw sexuality, and Natalia plays the perfect winged dove. The ending for me is one of my favorites, if not the favorite ending. For England, James? No. For me. I mean, come on! It's so good. It's such a perfect ending, and I love everything about it. Every great Bond movie needs a great villain to make it that top echelon of Bond movies. GoldenEye does this with the best villain ensemble of all time, but it also does so with a very strong main antagonist in Alec Trevelyan, aka Giannis, the two-faced Roman god that becomes a 00 agent for England, but then turncoats against England due to what the Crown did to his family. His family are Leanne's Cossacks. Alec goes on to explain it was his British betrayal that led to his parents' death. And this movie touches upon the plotline, but doesn't delve into the topic very much. This got me wondering, what the hell happened to the Cossacks? To truly appreciate the complexity of this storyline, you have to understand what actually happened to Leanne's Cossacks. What was it that the British did that was so terrible that Alec could never forgive them?
What do you expect from a Cossack?
Who?
This Giannis, I never met the man, but I know he's a Lienz Cossack.
Group that worked for the Nazis against the Russians. Second World War.
You know your history, Mr. Bond. At the end of the war, the Lienz Cossacks surrendered to the British in Austria, believing they would join your government and wage war against the communists. But the British betrayed them, sent them back to Stalin, who promptly had them all shot. Women, children, families.
Not exactly our finest hour.
The Lienz Cossacks are based out of southern Ukraine. They lived in clans that are derived from the major rivers where they reside. These clans consist of Don Cossacks, Kuban Cossacks, and Ural Cossacks. They are well known for their proficiency on horseback. During the Bolshevik Revolution, the Cossacks were viewed by the Red Army as sympathetic to the Tsar. They fought against the Red Army and were proficient at tactics and guerrilla warfare. When the Red Army was victorious, they were particularly cruel with their retribution towards the Cossacks. In a theme that would become common for the Cossacks, they ended up fighting on the losing side. Even though they really have no affiliation with either side, they really just want to be left alone. Stalin and the Soviets hated the Cossacks. They were viewed as disloyal and never truly accepted as Soviets. Stalin never wanted to use them for the Red Army, but as World War II became imminent, Stalin needed as many bodies as possible. As the war began, Stalin introduced them as part of the Red Army, but shortly after the war began, Cossacks began defecting to the German forces. On August 3, 1941, 70,000 Cossacks defected to fight with the German army. By October 1942, 50,000 more Cossacks had defected to fight with the German army. And this wasn't due to a firm unity with Germany or a feeling of believing in the German cause. What these defections were was a result of the Cossacks being betrayed, killed, used, and treated as subhuman by Stalin. They had a choice to fight by a side they despised, who they believed was going to lose the war, or they could defect to the German side with whom they had not suffered decades of maltreatment. It seems unforgivable now to think of anyone for the Germans, but this was about survival. The Germans seemed unstoppable. The Soviets were weak and had suffered losses during the Russo-Finnish War, and it seemed inconceivable that the Soviets would survive. For this, the Cossacks viewed the defection to Germany as their only means of survival. They also reveled at the opportunity to kill Soviets. The enemy of my enemy is my friend, and it was a chance for the Cossacks to get their retribution for the crimes they suffered at the hands of the Soviets and Stalin. Hitler made it clear that any Russian captured would not be given POW status. This meant that the laws of basic human rights would not apply to the Germanized to any Russian. For all these reasons, it was a grim choice, but a clear one to the Cossacks. By 1945, it was clear to the world, Germany was going to lose the war. The Cossacks knew this too. It was their time to plan to surrender. They tried to surrender in a way that would make a peaceful ending to their story. This, however, would not be so. As the end of the war neared, the three victors met in pivotal conferences that shaped how modern history is today. The first conference happened in Tehran, Iran, in November 1943. Germany was beginning to fall apart and had overextended their forces. They had underestimated how difficult it would be to fight fronts from every angle. The overextension had taken its toll on the soldiers, resources, and resolve was wearing thin. At this conference, the United States and Great Britain planned to launch the invasion in northern France, what would then become known as D-Day. This was a strategic plan to fight the Germans on yet another front, which they were ill-equipped to handle at the time. In addition, Stalin agreed to join the war on Japan once Germany was defeated. In 1945, the three Axis powers met again in Yalta. Franklin Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, and Stalin met to finish up the final stages of the war and planned for the imminent victory. As the world was being divided up by these three powers, Stalin was the one of the three with more resolve and more left to fight in him. By this time, England and the US had no fight left in them. Europe was destroyed, the US was across 2 oceans, millions were dead, and everyone just wanted this the hell over with. For this reason, the US and Great Britain ceded on things that they otherwise would not have for Stalin. One of these cessions that was made was something called reciprocal repatriation. What this essentially is the return of humans to their perceived homeland from the displacement that was rampant through Europe. Travel was not as readily accessible as today, and thousands of people were stranded in foreign lands with dwindling resources. And while the idea seems noble on its face, there was a dark side to this agreement. Churchill and Roosevelt both knew the consequences for some of what returning to Stalin would mean. Stalin was a notorious murderer, and he accounted for far more deaths than Hitler did. He ruled with unrelenting malice. It was even agreed that Germany would surrender to Russia and take the glory. The Axis powers needed Russia though. They had the troops, they had the bodies, and Stalin still had fight left in him. To keep Stalin in the fight, to keep him on the side, these cessions were made to keep Stalin on board. As the war was over, Cossacks were spread all throughout Italy, Yugoslavia, Austria, and near the Slovenian border. The main concentration of Cossacks were in Lienz, Austria. There was confusion about what to do next. The Cossacks believed that the war would continue. The Cossacks believed that the next front would be against the Soviets and Stalin. The Cossacks believed that they weren't as much fighting with Germany, but against the Soviets. And it seemed logical for the Cossacks' ranks that they would pledge their allegiance to Great Britain and continue the march into Soviet territory to get rid of Stalin. Great Britain, on orders from London, perpetuated this ruse. They sent out to Cossack leadership that they would be held under the umbrella of Great Britain. It was a lie from the onset, a gentle nudge off the cliff rather than a shove. Once the Cossacks were centralized in Lienz, Austria, they were then asked to disarm. This rose suspicion in the Cossack leadership, but they trusted the British, and they trusted what they were being told. The Cossack command was then rounded up and separated from the masses. This was of critical importance to Stalin that Cossack commanders be handed over to Stalin, and more specifically to the NKVD and Smersh. The NKVD and Smersh were Stalin's secret police. Ian Fleming used Smersh as the main antagonist in his novels until Spectre was introduced. The British knew the fate that they were leading these officers to, but it made no difference. The orders had been handed down. A convoy of British trucks, buses, jeeps, and armored cars arrived to escort the Cossack command from the camp. The Cossack command, still not fully aware of the betrayal that was about to befall them, voluntarily presented themselves for transport. And as the trip proceeded, Cossacks realized what was about to happen. Some of them even went so far as to kill themselves, while others held on to the hope of a not-so-bleak ending. Soldiers were under strict orders that if resistance is met, it is to be met with lethal force. If a soldier wished to commit suicide, they would be allowed to do so as long as it did not endanger British soldiers. 2,126 Cossack officers were delivered to the NKVD in Vienna, Austria, to be brought to Moscow for trial. Nearly all of the 2,126 Cossack officers never made it to Moscow, disappearing in what can only be assumed as meeting a grim, ruthless demise. After the officers were rounded up, the remaining Cossacks were told by the British that their command had betrayed them. They were ordered to denounce their command and accept their fate. The British also deemed that the horses of the Cossacks no longer belonged to them, but to His Majesty of the King of England. Outrage ensued, but by then it was too late. The Cossacks revered their horses. The Cossacks were corralled and disarmed. Their fate had long been determined in Yalta. The plan by Stalin, Churchill, and Roosevelt had come to fruition. Reality was upon them. It is estimated that 50,000 Cossacks were returned to Stalin, with most disappearing or ending up in labor camps to die there. Soldiers were haunted by having to round up women, children, and soldiers and send them to their dire fate. The British held fast to their stance on the Cossacks and the decision to hand them over to Stalin. It was clear appeasement to Stalin. The Cossacks were deceived and sacrificed to the Soviets for British benefit. Roosevelt and Churchill were heavily criticized for cessions they handed Stalin in the Yalta Conference. Roosevelt died only 2 months after this conference, and when Truman took over, he was much less accommodating to Stalin. Truman, Stalin, and Churchill, and later Prime Minister Clement Attlee, met in Potsdam Conference to finalize the ending of the war. By this time, Stalin had troops in much of Eastern Europe, and the cessions he won in Yalta, he was able to keep due to the war fatigue. Stalin had set up camp, and no one had the energy to kick him out. It was at this realization that Churchill deemed that an iron curtain had fallen over Eastern Europe. It was a clear message that the feeble cooperation that the Axis powers had was dissolved, and the Cold War was upon them. This has been it. This has been the Lance Cossacks of the GoldenEye episode. I hope that knowing the story and knowing how dirty the British did the Lance Cossacks, that you guys have a further appreciation for the story. Next time you watch GoldenEye and you hear the Lance Cossacks and you hear the back and forth between Valentine and Bond about the Lance Cossacks, you have a deeper understanding of what it is that they're talking about, and you enjoy GoldenEye just a little bit more. This has been Donnie Waldron, Quantum of History. Until next time, what should they be doing?
Like what you saw, then hit that subscribe button. Comment down below and leave a like and hit that subscribe button. Why are you not hitting that subscribe button?